Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Found My Fitness podcast. I'm sitting here with Dr. Charles Raison, who is a professor at the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who's also the founding director of the Center for Compassion Studies at the University of Arizona, as well as many other interesting things which you can hear about in this episode of the Found My Fitness podcast. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast to have a discussion with you is because you've done some really interesting research on the effects of inflammation on the development of depression, as well as using what is very similar, what I would think to be very similar as the sauna, it's whole body hyperthermia, as a treatment for major depressive disorders. So very interesting topics that I'm interested in. So maybe we can start by talking a little bit about the role of inflammation, just generally speaking, in depression.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When people begin to realize back in the 80s that there was this link between the brain and the immune system that was more profound than we originally thought, right? I mean, originally people thought the immune system was down there dealing with infection, their brain was about behavior. Now, of course, we know that they're really one system. People thought about it in terms of immune suppression. I think so many things are lost from the lives of people with depression that it sort of made thematic sense to think that your immune functioning might be lost too. So it was really quite a shock in the 90s when assays got better and we began to realize that if you measured inflammatory markers, so these are chemicals like cytokines that get kicked up when you get the flu, something like that, then when you looked at those sort of chemicals, they were actually elevated in depressed people. And this was shown sort of again and again. And then we began to realize that if you were exposed to these chemicals, you were likely to get depressed. So some of the research that we did and many other people did beginning about 2000 was with drugs like interferon. So there's this thing called interferon alpha, which was used somewhat in cancer, but a great deal for many years to treat hepatitis C. And it's a chemical your body makes that basically turns on inflammation. If I were to take you and inject a bunch of interferon alpha into your arm, within an hour you'd be feeling sick. You'd have a fever, you'd feel crappy, and you'd want to lay down. And it activates all these inflammatory chemicals in your body. Turns out that if people do that to themselves on a repeated basis for something like curing hepatitis C, a very significant proportion of them become depressed. Many become like really clinically depressed, suicidal, hopeless, helpless.
Like long-term?
Well, long-term while you're getting the treatment. The interesting thing is that the vast bulk of people recover pretty much completely within a couple of weeks of stopping it. So it really is this sort of drug. If you're constantly exposed to inflammatory stimuli at a high level, people get exhausted, depressed, their sleep gets messed up. Unfortunately, there are actually a number of data points suggesting that some people do have long-term, sort of mood disturbances after a chronic bout of inflammation from interferon. We know from other studies, sort of population studies, that if you have episodes of inflammation earlier in life, so for instance, if you have an autoimmune condition or if you have bad infections, the kind of infections that land you in the hospital, you're significantly more likely to subsequently develop significant major depression, but significant schizophrenia and other disorders too, right? So it looks like there's something about chronic inflammatory activation that induces changes in the brain and body that tee you up for depression. In fact, we can talk about this. We know a lot about what those changes are. So there was this convergence of data suggesting that inflammation, the sorts of acute, especially acute reactions your body does to dangerous pathogens, that those chemicals induce inflammation, induce depression. Now, we and others were some of the first to suggest that it may, in fact, there may be an evolutionary advantage to inflammation inducing depression. And we could talk about that, but the fact that those things are linked is pretty clear.
Yeah, please do talk about because to me, what would be the advantage to developing depression from an evolutionary standpoint?
Well, the argument here is that that human depression may have evolved out of sickness, and there's actually a fair amount of evidence to suggest that may be the case. So, for one thing, if you make a list of the symptoms that you have when you're acutely sick, and you cross those with the symptoms you have when you're depressed, there's a really significant overlap. Depressed people are a little bit more likely to want to kill themselves, or a little bit more likely to have sort of be down on themselves. That doesn't happen as often in sickness, but many symptoms, and some very surprising ones, are shared by depression and sickness. The example I often give is hyperthermia, right? So, when you're really sick, when inflammation is activated, one of the things it does is induce a fever, right? We've known for many years that if you take medically healthy depressed people, they have chronic elevations in their body temperature. And it follows the same sort of diurnal pattern as you see in sickness. So you see more of this elevation at night. And there's some very interesting data actually done up the road in Los Angeles at UCLA in the 90s, that if you measure core body temperature of people that are not depressed and versus people that are, the depressed people's body temperature is higher. Then if you treat them, in this case they used electroconvulsive therapy, which is very, very rapidly acting, powerful treatment. You treat the depressed people, you measure their body temperature again, bang, it goes right down to the level of control people. And we've known for a long time that depression is a hyperthermic state. But if you look at the things that happen physiologically when you get sick, one of the things that happens is something called an acute phase reaction. So you get a change in the chemicals that your liver makes, right? So you get a downgrading of sort of housekeeping chemicals like albumin, and you get uprising of things like CRP, and you tend to also do things like lose iron, lose zinc. And you say, why? When you get sick, why do you punt your iron? Well, the answer is because the microbes, especially intercellular bacteria, need the iron more than you do. They have to have that iron to replicate. You can live for a while without iron, but they can't. And there's all sorts of data showing that, for instance, iron supplementation kills you if you're infected. Or kids that are given iron in high pathogen third world areas are much more likely to die of infection. So, what happens with evolution is you get this suite of reactions that, although sometimes costly to the person or to the person's body, are generally more costly to the bacteria. So the reason that we get sick when inflammation gets activated is not just because nature wants to torture us. It's because if you make a list of all the things that happen, many of them have been shown to be pathogen protective. So for instance, hyperthermia, fever, is a powerful pathogen protector for a couple of reasons. First off, it sort of ramps up immune functioning. But most microorganisms are not built to last. They're built cheap. That's why they can actually mutate so quickly. So they tend to unwind at higher temperatures. And so, a fever is an antipathogen. It's an antibiotic strategy, right? And so it's very striking that depression is so reliably associated with things like shunting your iron or shunting your zinc, raising your body temperature, And so if you think about, why would those characteristics occur in a condition like depression that we think of as being largely psychosocial? If your girlfriend dumps you and you get depressed, it might make sense why you weep and cry, and maybe you sit down and it makes you reevaluate your life. But why should it elevate your body temperature? Why should it cause your iron stores to be reduced? On the other hand, if depression evolved out of sickness as a strategy for pathogen defense, all those things make a lot of sense, right? And so the argument is that if you look at the things that killed hominids and human beings before about 10,000 years ago, they were largely not the infectious agents that killed us across history, right? So most people died of things like malaria and smallpox and measles, these horrible crowd infections over the last 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture. Before that, most people died from trauma. It's interesting, sometimes inflicted by other people, just getting scraped, getting cut up. The things that kill you from trauma are much more likely to be extracellular bacterial things. Those are the types of organisms that are especially likely to be wiped out by the kind of sickness reactions that get activated both in depression and sickness. So we and others have made the argument that this is the way to think about it, that until modern times, stress was a reliable indicator that you were at a significantly increased risk of wounding. And wounding is going to kill you because you're going to get infection. So stress becomes linked with a prepotent inflammatory activation so that your immune systems kind of run to their guard stations. It's like smoke alarm principle, Stress means you're at increased risk of dying from a wounding-based infection. So stress becomes reliably associated with inflammation, right? Mm-hmm. Inflammation induces sickness, but sickness and depression share a lot in common. So over time what happens is that anything that signals a need for increased inflammation activates this suite of behaviors that in humans over time also sort of evolves into depression. So it's an even deeper way of saying that in fact the link between inflammation and depression may be deeper across evolutionary time and for adaptive purposes than it actually is in terms of mechanism.
That's
interesting.
Very interesting, yeah, because I've always just sort of looked at the mechanism, and I know you've got a couple of papers on the
evolution, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't quite read too much into that, but that is certainly a very interesting hypothesis.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure how you would test that, but it makes sense.
Well, there are some interesting ways to test it, right? So some of it, of course, is just cross-sectional. You can line up the genes that finding genes that are reliably associated with depression has been somewhat of a fool's errand because it's such a polygenic disorder. But if you make a list of the best contenders and then you go ask the genes, so SNPs in genes that we know the functional capacity of, right? The form of the gene that's associated with depression, does it provide any anti-pathogen benefits? And it turns out that almost 100% of the time it does. So if you make a list, so we think about something like the MTHFR gene, right, that's involved in folate metabolism, right? So there's a form of it that seems to be a depression risk factor. So if you look at what it does immunologically, it is probably pro-inflammatory, and it's strongly associated with increased survival in sub-Saharan Africa. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, so many people interestingly die of hepatitis B. And the form of the gene that may be a risk factor for depression is actually protective against that illness. So in one of our papers, we rustled up maybe 30 genes and showed sort of across the board these really fascinating things, right? So there's that. There's evidence that forms of genes that are pro-inflammatory increase your risk of death in low pathogen areas, but increase your risk of survival in high pathogen areas. There's a fascinating study out of the Netherlands, actually, now probably 10 years ago, looking at Ghana, which is an interesting country because there's parts of the country that have sort of been cleaned up. They have fresh water, they have clean water from wells, and so pathogen deaths are low there. There's other parts of the country where people are still drinking from polluted rivers. And they did this fascinating study where they looked at this sort of haplotype in the TNF gene that is known to have an inflammatory. If you have one form of it, you have higher levels of inflammation. If you have the other, you have lower levels. As you'd predict, in parts of the country where you are protected, so clean water, not going to die from infection. If you have the high TNF, low IL-10, the sort of the pro-inflammatory haplotype, in the parts of the country with low pathogen, you die sooner. But in high pathogen areas, protective, and the protection all occurs in the early part of the lifespan, up to the age of 40, where across evolutionary time, that's where you want to survive, because that's where you're going to reproduce and live long enough to probably get your kids into survival age. So there's that, and then there's another really interesting thing, which is, you and I'm sure you share with me an interest in this possibility that part of the link between sort of metabolic immunodisturbances and behavioral disturbances may be an evolutionary mismatch in modern times, right? So we know that there's you can make a laundry list of factors of the modern world that are pro-inflammatory and that are associated with depression. And so there's an idea, and I've written a lot about this. I'm on both sides of this debate. It's interesting, but there is an argument that depression might be something of a more modern phenomenon arising from this sort of evolutionary mismatch between the way we live now that's so pro-inflammatory and how we evolved to live, right? And there's evidence that rates of depression have really kind of risen a great deal in many parts of the modern world in the last 50 years at exactly the times when our diets become more pro-inflammatory, where we've been separated from a lot of immunoregulatory organisms in the environment. But if that's the story, then you would not expect to see depression being ancient, for one thing, but especially you wouldn't expect to see any type of link between inflammatory activation and depression in people that are not living in a modern lifestyle, right? So one argument, and again, these are circumstantial arguments, but one argument for the fact that perhaps this link between inflammation and depression serves an evolutionary purpose is that it should precede modern environments. And so these folks, they're anthropologists at the University of New Mexico, actually went down to this group called the Tsunami, which they're kind of agriculturalists, semi-hunter-gatherers down in the lowlands of Bolivia. So they actually went down there to test these ideas, and so they developed these really culturally appropriate depression questionnaires, and then they drew their blood and looked at their inflammatory status. And very consistent with the idea that this link between inflammation and depression is an evolved old thing. They found that the folks living in this completely different, much closer to the way most humans lived across most of time. Depression looked very much like it does here. People do get depressed. They get depressed for a lot of the same reasons. Depression was powerfully correlated with increased inflammation. And interestingly, when they did functional assays, the depressed people showed better immune responses to some of the pathogens, some of the types of things that would be pathogens in their world, again suggesting that there's a link between depression and actually increased survival from infection. So it turns on its head this idea that something like depression is sort of a killer because it dampens your immunity. It really is the opposite. So anyway, there's a very, I particularly think that the link between inflammatory activation and depression goes way back in mammalian phylogeny, and really probably initially had to do with our ability to manage our relationships with the microbial world, not as much our relationships with conspecifics, although it later got usurped for conspecific stuff.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Very, very fascinating. So sort of talk about, I don't know if there's necessarily, if those things are mutually exclusive with the term, in terms of the depression having this evolutionary origin and
being
modern day
by,
mismatch.
It's probably a two-hit.
Yeah,
two bad
right.
hits.
And if you think about it, for example, you mentioned, there's so many things in our environment that are pro-inflammatory, diet, lack of the light exposure changing. But like if you look at people that are obese or people that have metabolic syndrome, most of the time have very high markers of inflammation, not always, and they also are more likely to get depressed, correct?
Absolutely.
Has there been any evidence to see whether or not the inflammation's driving that?
Oh yes, absolutely. The best paper I know of was done by Lucille Capuron and Andy Miller. Lucille's in Bordeaux, Andy's at Emory, where they looked at a cognitive behavioral disturbance, body mass index, and inflammation, and showed that the link between sort of obesity and these behavioral cognitive problems was mediated by the increased inflammation. Right, so anybody in this field knows that body mass index, how fat you are, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to the link between inflammation and anything. Right, so all this. There's just a linear relationship. I just did this huge study on like 600 people with a large pharmaceutical company where I worked with them on their data, looking at prediction of inflammation and response to a medication. And it's just it's just like a straight line. The more the heavier you are, especially unfortunately for us men, especially here, big production of because we know that fat cells are big producers of inflammation.
Exactly, right. And what about, have there been studies looking at whether or not, so those people that are, for example, obese or overweight and are have higher levels of inflammatory biomarkers, if they lose the weight, does their depression risk decrease? Like, is there any evidence of that?
The only data I know of from that are people that have had these gastric bypass surgeries for weight loss, and there's some data showing that they've administered kind of quality of life, well-being, mood stuff. People's moods get much better. Now it's a confound, though, of course.
Yeah,
because,
of course.
Yeah, all of a sudden you can get in your bikini,
look better. Yeah.
Maybe so, but it would be consistent with that idea.
Yeah, it certainly would be interesting to look at that. And in terms of some of those studies you mentioned, where you're administering pro-inflammatory cytokines like interferon alpha, and I think endotoxin, which is a component of bacterial outer cell membranes that can induce inflammatory response. How those can immediately cause people to have depressive symptoms, and then if they continue taking it, I actually have a friend of mine who has polycythemia, and he was, which you make too many red blood cells, and he was part of a clinical trial at Stanford where they were administering interferon I don't know what, maybe it was alpha.
I think it's beta for that.
Oh, was it beta? Okay.
I think so.
So, but what was interesting is that he had to like leave the trial because his mood was traumatically affected. And he's usually like someone in really good spirits, very optimist, sort of person.
Yes.
And so he had to stop that treatment because it literally was making him, depressed. So that was sort of an interesting anecdote. But in terms of like some of the mechanisms that are responsible, people, like you said, we used to think the immune system was separate from the brain, and like there's the blood-brain barrier and nothing's penetrating it. Now we know these things are connected. In fact, the lymphatic system's connected to the brain. These inflammatory mediators are crossing the blood-brain barrier, getting into the brain, and disrupting neurotransmission.
Absolutely. Yep. Cells get into the brain. This is the work of Jonathan Kipnis. Fascinating. Well, so there's a couple things to say. But let me tell you something interesting about this business, about the endotoxin, the LPS and the typhoid stuff. So the folks in London, Hugo Critchley's group, they tended to use typhoid, and they showed that, you give normal folks a shot of typhoid, which activates a sort of acute, mild. It's not like interference like a sledgehammer, right? I mean, this is more like a dink. But you do that, and people report feeling more socially isolated. They feel more dysphoric, and you see changes in their brain that are sort of speak to depressive brain functioning. And the folks at UCLA used the LPS endotoxin, sort of saw the same thing, especially in women. Not so much in men. It seems like there's a tropism for women, which is an interesting thing. There's an evolutionary story there, perhaps too. But what's interesting is there's a counter. There is a little bit of counter data. This was done years ago in Germany, where they actually took people that were catastrophic. It's a small study, but they took people that had been inpatient, catastrophically depressed, and they shot them up with endotoxin, and it produced a powerful antidepressant response. Now, what's interesting about that is that there's a relevant animal study from Raison in Israel, where they took mice, and I'm pretty sure it's mice, not rats, and subjected them to this 20-day horrible stressor. And they showed that the stressor crazy activates inflammation, leads to apoptosis, death of microglial cells in the brain, and huge anxious depressive behavior afterwards, right? So what's interesting was they showed that if you blocked inflammation right before the start of the stressor, you block it, you can prevent the apoptosis, you can prevent the downstream behavioral effects. It's protective, right? If you do nothing here and you let the little rodents go through the horrible stressor and you block inflammation afterwards, they do worse. If you stimulate inflammation, they get an antidepressant response. So there's a little bit of a back current that I'm one of the few people, but there are some of us that are interested in this idea that inflammation's a funny thing, right? So these cytokines, these classic inflammatory molecules like TNF, tumor necrosis factor alpha, IL-1 beta, IL-6, at lower levels in the brain, they actually have neurotrophic effects.
Kind of like a hormetic stressor where they're
we don't know. Is it stressor, or is it just that they evolved? Nature's so cheap, it always wants to reuse things, and that's what makes things, evolutionary processes do this constantly. And it's why things are, one of the reasons why biologic systems are hard to understand. If they've generated TNF knockout mice, they can't find their way out of a bag. They're dumb as dirt, right? So there's something about lower levels of these mediators that may actually be beneficial in the CNS at least, and then there's sort of a U, and then all of a sudden, man, very, very rapidly, they become what we think of as counterproductive. They become depressive inducing. They cause tissue damage. Now, they evolve for a purpose. I mean, if that was just a negative thing, that would not happen. I mean, life is such a rough competitive game, and there's probably, it may be the case that the reason that you get this sort of CNS inflammation from either from peripheral cells coming into the CNS or from these resident macrophage type CNS cells being activated, it's probably a way of reducing the risk of pathogen manipulation, where you basically, because if it's interesting, if you look at when inflammation gets activated in the CNS, it has trophic effects. It doesn't just go everywhere. It tends to go to an area called the cingulate cortex and the dopamine areas down in the ventral striatum. And we and others have suggested it may be a way of trying to take these areas offline so that they're not able to be manipulated by pathogens. You know, you don't necessarily want bugs driving your system. And we now know that many of these sort of CNS organisms, like, you know, the thing that, it'll come to me, that drives crazy dopamine behavior, that a lot of times these microorganisms will actually, you know, change behavior in ways that benefit their survival and reproduction. So
Toxoplasmosis.
yeah, right. So there's probably an evolutionary reason for why you see this U-shaped curve, but that may also explain why, you know, we've been working on the idea that people have been really, really chronically depressed. You know, so if you look at people that are chronically depressed, and we talked about the fact that, you know, the inflammation is elevated in depression, right? It's true, but it's only true in a certain way. So if what you really see is, you know, for any inflammatory biomarker, here's where it's at if you're healthy. Here's where it's at if you have the flu or you get rheumatoid arthritis, right? If you're healthy, here's where it's at. And if you're healthy and depressed, it's here, right? Now, day in, day out, that's enough to set you up for every evil thing: heart attacks, strokes, dementia. I mean, because it's that gradual wear and tear. But then if you look more closely, what you really see is this, so that there's huge overlap between depressed people and not depressed people. So there's lots of depressed people that are desperately depressed that have low levels of inflammation. And it's only some that are elevated. Now, I thought for many years, because I'm kind of a lumper, not a splitter, that maybe what you were looking at here was that the depressed people, that they're all inflammatory, simple thing, that some depressed people just have higher inflammation and that's what's doing it. And other people may be depressed because they're more sensitive to inflammation, but that it's all too much inflammation in one way or other, you know. We now are pretty sure that that's not true, that in fact, the reason that depression is associated with increased inflammation is because there's a subgroup of depressed people that have elevated inflammation, and they're different than depressed people that don't. And this is the work of my mentor, Andy Miller, in the last 5 or 7 years. They've just been world leaders showing that if you take regular old depressed people, he got like 250 of them and did this amazing series of studies. People that have, there's not a cutoff, but people that have higher levels of inflammation and are depressed have different functional connectivity in their brains than people that have lower levels. And we showed, Andy and I showed years earlier, that they also have very different responses to immune agents than people that have lower levels of inflammation. So I think, in fact, that there's a subgroup of very depressed people that might benefit from a kind of a not chronic inflammation, but a hit of inflammation. And when we get around to talking about hyperthermia, I can tell you that there's some evidence that hyperthermia does that. Exercise does that. You know, exercise acutely activates certain types of pathways we think about as being inflammatory. So I think in the next 10 years, what we're going to find out is that in fact the immune system is probably involved in every case of depression, but that the pattern is going to be subtler and more complex than something just saying that depression is associated with increased inflammation. That's probably not going to turn out to be true.
And with the exercise, I've read now several studies where, you know, exercise is, you know, aerobic exercise and now even strength training exercise, how it's almost in some cases as potent as some of these antidepressants that are out there in terms of treatment. And as you mentioned, you know, and this is kind of why I was thinking of this hormetic effect, because exercise does elevate inflammatory processes acutely, and then there's a response.
Them. Yes.
Yeah, anti-inflammatory response, oxidative response that, you know, is much more powerful than the initial, you know, stressor that occurred. But so exercise is something that I think you had even published some studies, or a study talking about the effects of exercise on what was very interesting to me, what you had called the inflammatory response that was induced postprandially, so after you eat a meal.
Oh, yes.
It is. It's really, what's interesting to me is I've only really heard one other person, a colleague of mine who's brilliant. His name is Mark Shignaga. He is a gut expert, so he studies the gut health, microbiome, and he you know, talks about how this postprandial inflammatory response occurs because, you know, food is hard on the gut, and
it's a foreign substance. It's a risk.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, thousands of people die every year from eating out in the United States.
Yeah, that's true. But even in addition to that, in addition to the bacteria that can, you know, come along with eating some bad food, is that just that the gut itself, the gut barrier is sort of, to some degree gets compromised. With every meal, you're releasing a little bit of endotoxin in the bloodstream because your immune system's activated.
You get a leaky gut.
Yeah, and so you are there is an inflammatory response that occurs, insulin, in itself, the insulin response and all that. So I thought it was very interesting that you were looking specifically at that and the effects of exercise that exercise had on that.
No, I don't think that. But we've written about this phenomenon.
Oh, you've written about it. Okay.
Well, and the other thing is, when you eat, it kind of gives you a fever. Do you know about diet-induced thermogenesis? So every time you eat, your body temperature elevates. That's why sometimes people say they sweat after they eat, because it's not a fever per se, because I don't think I don't know whether it upregulates the thermoregulatory set point, but we've known for years that, and again, you think about, well, why? Partly because you got to burn off the energy, but it may also be that, again, hyperthermia has antibiotic effects, right? So it is true that it is any time a foreign substance comes in contact with a vulnerable entry point into the body, there's a risk of infection and death, right? There's a risk of infection and death, there's a risk of pathogen manipulation, there's all sorts of things. So it shouldn't be surprising that that happens, right? Nor should it be surprising that fasting has a powerful anti-inflammatory effect. And there's some beautiful data in animals, but also beautiful data in humans. There was a study in 19 normal volunteers, and they looked at the effect of a 24-hour fast on something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. It's the thing, it's an intracellular thing that connects up and it activates inflammation. It turns on this thing called IL-1 beta. So you fast, and the gene expression for that complex just goes down, 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 down. Then they let the people eat again. It goes up, 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 up. And if they look at that at sort of leaky gut, and you find that eating sort of opens the gut up to leakiness too. Which may be just a bummer. That may just be that we can't be built better than that, or it may be an evolved adaptive mechanism to kind of activate a little bit of inflammation. That way you kind of get things kicked up in your body. You look around, right? I think the core idea here we were talking about this in terms of the evolution of depression is nature's really smart. It's a compromise. It's not perfect, but you go, oh geez, man, that's bad. You get a leaky gut when you eat. Well, yeah, but across millions of years, if that was so bad, the gut would have figured out a way not to do that. It probably is an evolved strategy that every time you're exposed to death by an infection, the body responds with a little bit of prepotent inflammatory response just to get everything kicked up and to deal with it, And of course, yeah, you pay a little bit of a price in terms of tissue damage, but it's like the smoke alarm principle. That little bit of damage is more than outweighed for the one time you don't do it and then you die.
Yeah, right. And so it totally makes sense because the gut is what is exposed to the internal environment, right? So
you think about that's the big one, right?
Right.
I mean, the skin is a much more robust protector against any membrane that's wet is just bad news, right? In that way, but it has to be for us to survive and eat, and this is sort of the compromise that we've evolved.
I'm pretty interested in when you're mentioning this hyperthermia. In terms of people that are depressed having elevated core body temperature. I'm super interested in the study that you published where you had used whole body hyperthermia to treat major depressive disorder, or at least a single bout of it seemed to have a lasting effect for 6 weeks. Whole body hyperthermia to me is it sounds very similar to using something like a sauna. Would you say?
It is? Yeah. It's just the heat. I mean, the machine's fancy. It's like a $50,000 machine. It uses infrared lights. It kind of cooks you from the inside out, and that allows you to get hotter with less misery. Because saunas, I mean, you're getting it right on your. It's hard, right?
It's definitely hard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big steam room sauna fan, but the box is very different. So I put myself in this machine to see what I was doing to people. And I've never been, so to back up, yes, you're right, and we did do a study, and we treat people to a core body temperature of 38.5 centigrade, which is 101 point something or other, which is unbelievably hot if you don't want to be that hot. I mean, I had never been that hot in my life. I mean, sweat was just pouring off my body, and I was huffing and puffing. I felt like I'd been running for 10 miles out in the Sonoran Desert summer, It's really hot. It's mild hyperthermia, but it's hot. Now, we have colleagues, David Michelin and Marin Nair at Harvard, that have joined us in the hyperthermia work, and she especially is interested and has a grant to study hot yoga and convince people to wear a rectal probe while they're doing hot yoga. And hot yoga, which also makes people sweat like pigs, elevates core body temperature to, interestingly, exactly the same place, 38.5, right? And a lot of people, when I talk about hyperthermia and give talks to folks, a lot of people, if it's a crowd, will come up afterwards and say, well, hot yoga. A lot of people are hooked on hot yoga.
Yeah.
And it's because, I'm convinced, it's because it's an antidepressant strategy, that they are essentially doing something very similar to what we do in the box. And most people, it took about an hour and a half for most people to get up to that 38.5. And then when that happened, we turned off the heat, but we left people in the box because it stayed warm, and their core body temperature remains elevated for at least another hour. So even the timing of hot yoga is probably consistent with sort of our hyperthermia machine.
So the hot yoga, a sauna, I mean, maybe a hot bath, like if you say.
Yeah,
so basically anything that's
it's the heat. Yeah, it's
yeah.
the heat. And there's some interesting data on hot baths improving autistic symptoms, right? And there's people looking at this in New York, right? So there's a story there.
Yeah. So there's a personal story for me in terms of the sauna. One of the reasons why I got so into using the sauna was because in graduate school, I lived across the street from a YMCA, and they had a sauna there, and so I was just using the sauna, and I'd go I'd use the sauna before I would go into the lab and do my experiments for the day. And as graduate school is extremely stressful. Failed experiments, sometimes setting you back 6 months, and lots of stress. I mean, just 16-hour experiments you have to do, and you got to publish, and then you got to publish. So it's very stressful. And what I started to notice was, for whatever reason, using the sauna really, really lowered my anxiety and my ability to deal with the stress. Like I was
much
much easier for me to deal with all the stress. And it was extremely noticeable, and enough for me, to start to go, something's going on here. Yeah. So I started looking in the literature. Of course, my husband Dan was doing the same thing, and he had definitely noticed the same thing. Yeah. And so, what was really interesting, I looked in the literature and found, that using the heat stress in general increases. You dump a bunch of beta endorphins. Okay, well that's obvious. That happens with exercise. I think part of the like you mentioned, when you're running or exercising vigorously, your core body temperature is elevated, and that's sort of part of that endorphin response. But what was really interesting to me was, like, at the same time, a friend of mine who was doing some research on the opioid pathway, and he was looking at the kappa opioid pathway. So mu opioid receptors bind endorphins, and kappa opioid, or sort of the opposite of endorphins, is sort of the dysphoric.
Depressogens.
Yeah, dysphoric feeling. You don't feel great. And he was telling me about some research where if you agonize the receptor, the kappa opioid receptor, what ends up happening is a feedback where you have the mu opioid receptors much more sensitive to endorphins, and you basically are having more of these receptors and they're more sensitive. So then I started to look in the literature and found that something that we make in our brain endogenously called dynorphin is upregulated when you're exposed to heat because it cools your body down. And so I started to go, well, I wonder, so for example, there are studies where you expose rats to heat stress and they increase their dynorphin. Yeah. And I said, well, what if the dynorphin binding to the kappa-opioid receptor does actually sensitize mu opioid receptors to beta endorphin? So I thought, oh, maybe that's a possible mechanism why I'm feeling so good, like a lasting effect, where it's like later on, weeks later, I'd still feel really, really good. So that's sort of an interesting personal story from me. I'm not sure if you've ever looked into the dynorphin or beta endorphin.
So this is a fascinating thing. Yes, indeed. So it turns out, that almost certainly within the next 6 months, there's going to be a major FDA approval for a very novel antidepressant that does the opposite of what you're talking about. It antagonizes, the kappa receptor. So it's exactly the opposite. Now, interestingly though, and I have an interest in psychedelic medicines, somebody called salvinorin A is a kappa agonist. And there's also some significant interest at lower doses as an antidepressant, right? So here's an example of this phenomenon. It's a meta issue. And I don't mean like meta, like the Buddhist meditation thing, but meta, M-E-T-A, that opposites sometimes do the same thing. It's interesting. There's a thing called enantiodromia. It goes all the way back to Heraclides, back in sometimes you can get the same effect by doing opposite things. So the fact that hyperthermia stimulates kappa receptors and the fact that blocking them could maybe also have an antidepressant effect. It's fascinating, but it's consistent with these sort of weird, again, maybe kind of U-shaped thing, or the fact that opposites can sometimes do the same thing. We don't know from our studies, we don't know the role that the opioid system played in our outcomes. This is something that we're going to look at down the road. We looked at a bunch of immune stuff.
Mm-hmm. And what did you find with the hyperthermia?
Well, we found that hyperthermia does exactly the same thing that exercise does.
Okay.
Which is not so surprising, right? Which is quite interesting. So to kind of nerd out on the inflammatory pathway, right? When you get sick, what happens is you get activation of these two primary pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-1 beta and this thing, tumor necrosis factor, TNF. So IL-1 beta and TNF, they get activated. They do all sorts of stuff. They're really pro-inflammatory. They secondarily activate another cytokine called interleukin-6 or IL-6. Now, IL-6 is a bad guy, I think. The studies, so it's the one that's most consistently elevated somewhat in depression. There's all sorts of evidence that if it's elevated, if you're a Western person hanging around, and if I measure your IL-6, and if it's up, bad. You're going to get heart attacks, you're going to get strokes, you're going to get cancer, you're going to get, it's a bad deal to have your IL-6 just going to shrink your hippocampus. We know a lot of stuff about that. So it's a bad boy, and it's activated by IL-1, but it's a sort of secondary. We've also known for years that I say it sometimes it's a Janus-faced cytokine. It faces two directions because it also has anti-inflammatory effects, right? It activates IL-10, and so what you see with bad infection, IL-1, TNF, they shoot up, IL-6 goes up, and you're sick, and that's how it is, right? What exercise seems to do is it activates IL-6 like crazy, but it doesn't activate IL-1 or TNF. Mm-hmm. In the blood, if you really, really exercise like a maniac, yeah, you can get slight increases. If you look at sort of maybe less, like horrible, killer exercise, you see this big increase in IL-6. If you pull out people's blood cells and stimulate them, you actually see reduced release of TNF and IL-1, and that's that anti-inflammatory thing you're talking about, right? So you get this IL-6 response, and then you get this sort of IL-10 coming along, which is powerfully anti-inflammatory, right? That's what we see with hyperthermia.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So in this study, the challenge, we did a first small open sort of clinical study in Switzerland. With these colleagues of mine found an old hyperthermia machine in the basement of this crazy alternative treatment psychiatric kind of castle hospital. And one of the guys is an engineer. He rebuilt the thing, and we started just sticking people in it, and we saw this powerful antidepressant response. That we only looked at people 5 days later, but clearly 5 days later their scores were generally cut in half, right? So then we brought the work to America. And the challenge, of course, is that you're going to get a very big placebo response from, you make a deal about it, you sit in this box, you get hot, you go, oh my God, they're doing something for me. Right. So we had to invent a placebo, some kind of comparator. What are you going to compare it to? So what we did was we took this fancy box that has these big infrared lights, and we went down to Target. This was my colleague, Walter Jansen, brilliant guy for all sorts of mechanical stuff. He just went to Target, he bought a bunch of desk lamps, painted them orange so that they looked just like the light of the thing, hid them so you couldn't see that they were right there. The machine has a fan, we built a fake fan, and the machine has these heating coils down at the bottom that kind of make you warm, kind of comfy, toasty, but not like you're gonna die of the heat. And so we put people in the box, we turned on the fake lights, we turned on the heating coils down there and the fan, and 70%, more than 70% of the people that got the fake treatment thought they got the real treatment. So we asked them afterwards, did you get the real or the fake? And so the vast bulk said, oh, we got the real, because they were warm, and not everybody who got the real thought they got the real. It's interesting. I mean, their sweat's pouring off the body, but again, masochistic, they figure, there must be something worse than this, right? So the fact that we saw this massive difference between the two suggests that it has to do with the heat. And in fact, we've now realized that in fact the fake group, the sham group, they got more heat than we probably should have given them, and some of them actually went up, and those people had the same kind of antidepressant response as the other people, right? So we know it's the heat. So compared to that sham, as a group, their immune measures just stay flat. The people got the real heat, man. Their IL-6 shoots up. Now we measured it beforehand, after, And like dum-dums, we should have measured it like 6 hours later, but we measured it a week later. By a week later and 4 weeks later, all the immune measures are back. There's no move, right? But there's this huge IL-6. We looked at maybe 12 of these cytokines, none of the other ones moved. So it's just IL-6. Now what's interesting is the higher your IL-6 went up, if you look at the whole population, the higher your IL-6 went up, the more undepressed you were a week later. And there was a pretty strong correlation. The correlation is even stronger between how happy you were when you got out of the box. So the acute mood elevating effect, which you noticed from taking a sauna, is nicely correlated with increased IL-6. If you had an increased IL-6 response, you're going to be happier. Now this just flies in the face of this idea, right, that inflammation is just depressogenic, right? It really suggests that it depends. It depends on how long it is, it depends what context it happens, and it depends on how you think about something like IL-6, right? So then, you know, we had this really interesting finding, and after we found this, I was sitting with one of the great fathers of our field, a guy named Robert Danzer down in Houston, and I said, how could this be? And he said, well, measure something called neopterin. Neopterin is a chemical that's really only made by activated immune cells, by monocytes, these innate immune pro-inflammatory cells. So we measure neopterin. Neopterin also went up, and it correlated very strongly with the IL-6. So for quite a while, I thought, wow, I guess we're doing some kind of weird immune activation that I don't understand. But what I've come to realize more recently, and this is really working with these folks at Harvard, Simi Foster and the folks I mentioned, David Michelon and Marin, I think what's going on is that IL-6 is not just activated by immune cells, as we were talking about earlier, it's activated by fat cells, but it's really activated by muscle cells in the context of exercise, right, or in the context of heat. And there's animal data showing that if you induce heat shock, so if you really heat up a rodent, you get massive IL-6 production from the muscle cells that spills into the circulation and powerfully suppresses TNF and IL-1, so you don't get a rise there, which is exactly what we saw. So now I think what's going on is that, you talk about the immune system and the brain being one unified organ. Really, of course, so are the muscles. And IL-6, which is we think of as mostly an inflammatory cytokine in the context of sickness, is a myokine in the context of exercise. And we know in the context of exercise that IL-6 plays a key role in exercise's ability to induce insulin sensitivity. So if you block IL-6 in a rodent that exercises, you block all the beneficial metabolic effects.
Oh, wow.
Now, there's also a study, interestingly, showing that if you look at the beneficial effects of exercise on sort of muscle restructuring, this is in humans, if you exercise and take a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agent, you get rid of all those good effects.
Right, yeah.
You've seen that,
I
right?
think I've seen that. Also, there was another study very similar to the anti-inflammatory. They're taking the NSAIDs. So there's another study that showed taking high-dose alpha tocopherol and vitamin C, so antioxidants, also suppressed the insulin sensitivity effects of exercise.
Right.
Possibly through, because you're not activating that whole inflammatory
Well, exactly,
pathway,
because
right?
what you really would like to do is sometimes activate these compensatory systems, right?
Right.
So if you can activate your inflammation in a way, so you think about exercise, right? So we were talking off camera about, I think we were off camera about the fact that, I'm gonna go run around Mission Bay here, and I'm gonna get an increase in my inflammation. With these caveats that it's a certain pattern, but you get certainly your IL-6 is going to go up. But over time, the net result is a reduction in chronic inflammation. So it's like if you hit a system a certain kind of way, what I think is that it's like a spring. You kind of want the dial to be over here. So you'd think the simple thing to do would be just to move the dial over here, but that often weakens. You've been using the word hormesis, right? This is that idea,
exactly.
right? Exactly this idea. Doing this weakens the system's own sort of internal capacity. So what you get is a dependence on that external element to keep the system in that state, right? On the other hand, although it seems paradoxical, if you take it this way, but not chronically, but just, and you pull the spring back and you let it go, right? It sort of drives the system into that other state. So we have some evidence for this from hyperthermia. It's interesting. So you would think, if the world was simple, that if you're depressed and cold, I should heat you up. And if you're depressed and hot, I should cool you down. But in fact, the opposite's true. So in the European study, we actually very successfully measured core body temperature the day before they got to treatment, 5 days after, right? And what we found was that the hotter you were before you got into the box, the better antidepressant response you got.
I was going to ask you about that.
Right. And what we found from 5 days after being in the box, everybody's core body temperature was really lower over 24 hours. So the box didn't make people hotter, it made them cooler. What we were actually inducing was hypothermia. We used hyperthermia to induce hypothermia.
Long term, you mean?
Longer term.
Right. Which would be like almost like a hormetic.
It is.
Yeah.
It is a hormesis, right?
Yeah.
We toughened the system.
Yeah.
We toughened up the system. We recalibrated. We made, so what we think, and this is really the work of my colleague Christopher Lowry at UC Boulder in Colorado. What we think we've done is sensitize thermoregulatory cooling pathways so that the heat actually exercised them in some ways or shocked them into being more sensitive. And there's a giant literature on this fact that thermoregulation is impaired, as we said, in depression.
Yeah.
Depressed people can't cool off. They can't sweat, they can't cool off. And so what we think we've done is sensitize the pathways in the brain and the body that mediate those effects, and that's a marker for that sort of, we've also then strengthened anti-inflammatory,
It'd be interesting to look at like dynorphin, that whole system, because that is
I know,
involved
because
in
it's also what do they call a cryogen.
It
cools. Yes,
you know, don't schizophrenics also have a similar problem in terms of thermoregulation?
They do. They've got horrible. They've got really, really crazy thermoregulatory challenges, right? So I mean, when you see folks out, you know, it's a tragedy. When you see them out on the street, one of the things you notice about schizophrenics is it can be hot and they're wearing 3 or 4 coats, right? So they really, really have thermoregulatory problems. And if I think about it for a minute, I'll be able to tell you. There's a study, though, where they found that they do better. So what do they do better with? They do worse with cold and better with heat, or they do worse with heat? One of the two. But it's interesting that it's not all bad.
Yeah,
but
there's
their thermoregulation is absolutely whacked.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you see this. I mean, you see these guys, you know, and women. Right. So it's not just depression.
So I want to. I was making a mental note when you were talking about IL-6 being a myokine in the muscle, and because you know a very interesting. There's a few interesting studies that have been cropping up over the last couple of years in terms of another mechanism by which exercise, and specifically activating muscle cells, helps treat depression through this kynurenine pathway. And I guess, you know, for people that aren't familiar with kynurenine, it's basically a byproduct of tryptophan metabolism when your immune system's activated. In the case of chronic inflammation, for example, you're not converting tryptophan into serotonin.
That's right.
You're actually converting into something else called kynurenine, which activates immune cells, and you know. So, but the problem is that kynurenine can form. Is it quinolinic acid?
You can find kynureninic acid and quinolinic acid.
And
right.
that
quinolinic acid is definitely a neurotoxic agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's evolved into depression somehow.
Yeah, it is. So we actually did this study. Again, this is Andy Miller and I years ago. In the interferon alpha work, we had the good sense to do spinal taps on people, right? So we drew out the fluid around their brain, spinal fluid, and looked to see, does chronic inflammation delivered by interferon alpha change serotonin metabolism? So Michael Moss and Lucille Capirone and a number of people in the early 2000s began to show that chronic inflammation activated an enzyme called indolamine 2,3-dioxygenase, right? Yeah. And this is an enzyme that basically, as you said, takes tryptophan and shunts it away from serotonin into kynurenine. Now, there's an evolutionary advantage to this too. You don't want your bugs to have the serotonin, and you don't want them to have the tryptophan. So you block that enzyme, and death rates spiral in certain infections. And I can't remember. I used to know all this stuff, but there's certain infections where it's just lethal. I think leishmaniasis is one of them, I think, but I'm not sure about that. So anyway, yes, you get everything shunted to kynurenine. So what we showed was so everybody thought, so we knew that the more that enzyme got kicked up, the more depressed people got under chronic inflammation. That was shown by several different groups. It seems to be a reliable thing. But of course, this was just in people's blood. You can look at the ratio of kynurenine to tryptophan, and that tells you that how active that enzyme is. We got spinal fluid and showed that indeed, and this is really interesting, that interferon definitely jacks up kynurenine. Kynurenine levels in the blood and the spinal fluid are very, very similar. So we think it's getting across. Mm-hmm. But you see a massive increase in quinolinic acid and kynurenic acid. And setting aside the kynurenic acid, which is interesting, it's an NMDA antagonist. Quinolinic acid is an NMDA agonist. It causes neurotoxic effects. Quinolinic acid skyrocketed under interferon treatment. That's what associated with depression, powerfully. Now, on the other hand, we actually measured tryptophan in the blood and the spinal fluid around the brain, and there was no effect. Tryptophan falls in the periphery, but it's maintained in the brain. So there's I can't remember the name of it, but it's an amino acid pump. It's got a fancy name that basically actively transports amino acids. So although we never really followed up on this, the suggestion is that when you're under chronic inflammation, there's some sort of what's the word I want to use? Accommodation that's made so that your tryptophan, you preferentially shunt tryptophan into the central nervous system, probably because you got to have serotonin there, right?
Right. So what I know, at least with the inflammation, I'm not sure, but I know that exercise itself, and I'm getting sidetracked with what I originally wanted to say, but the exercise, so the transport system that transports tryptophan in the brain also transports branched-chain amino acids like leucine, isoleucine, which unfortunately outcompete tryptophan. However, exercise causes those branched-chain amino acids to be taken up into muscle cells, and it sort of alleviates the competition.
So you get more tryptophan.
You get more serotonin.
Yeah,
right. So
right. So isn't that interesting? So right. So it's so inflammation's hit upon sort of the same thing. So really, it looks like exactly it's that kynurenine and its metabolites may be almost. I mean, those results have been replicated, but probably they're probably more relevant bad actors through that pathway in terms of depressigenesis in the context of inflammation than is the drop in serotonin.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And so the studies that I was wanting to talk about or tell you about, you probably haven't even seen them, but where exercise, this has been shown now, it's first was shown in animal studies and then more recently in the past, I think it was 2017, it's been shown in humans where it causes muscle cells take up kynurenine, so they can't form quinolinic acid, which then means you're not getting
exactly.
that.
So you're not getting all that. That's right.
So there's another mechanism by which, and I'm not exactly sure why that happens or all the logistics, but that's another very interesting way. This exercise inducing the hyperthermic effect and the anti-inflammatory effect after the inflammation's generated, this hormetic effect, the serotonin, increased serotonin getting in the brain because there's so many different mechanisms by which exercise seems to affect depression in a positive way, and again the hyperthermia itself. So whether it's through the exercise or the hot yoga or the sauna or the hot bath or the steam shower.
Yes, these things interdigitate with each other in really interesting ways, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Are you familiar with heat shock proteins?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we're starting to look at. That's what we'll look at with the Harvard folks.
Oh, really? Take a look at, if you're not familiar with this study, I may have sent it to you, heat shock protein 105. So there was a study in mice where I'm not sure, I didn't read the whole method section, how they induced the heat shock protein 105 in mice, and then they subjected them to a battery of stress tests that they do to make depressive symptoms in animals as best they can. But what was found was that animals that had increased heat shock protein 105 were protected from these depressive symptoms, after their whatever stress test they did, and that was correlated with an increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor in one part of the brain region. I can't remember.
Yeah.
So the heat shock protein was causing an increase, like you were saying. I think inflammation itself.
Well, so you're right. So what we think now is actually the heat is probably activating these heat shock proteins, which is then contributing to the IL-6 being released probably from the muscles, which is then, we haven't done this study yet, so I don't know, but we're going to dump some IL-6 on immune cells to see if it can produce neopterin, because then it'd be sweet. Then we'd know, that the neopterin was, it wasn't that the immune cells were making the IL-6, it's the IL-6 then is maybe driving secondary immune effects, right? So, no, please do send me that, because I'm trying to bone up on, this is the greatest thing about science as opposed to art, unless you're just a great artist, is, in art, you're always trapped in your own head, right? That's why I like, pop stars, their songs all sound similar, right? Because they're operating in their own head. Science, nature is so much more complex than our imaginations that it takes you places. I mean, I started out running emergency psychiatry up at UCLA, and somehow over the last 20 years, I'm now having to teach myself about heat shock proteins.
Right. Yeah.
How did this happen? That was an immune system guy just trying to mind my own business. But the subtlety of evolved natural processes take you places.
Isn't it the best? I mean, the same thing happens with me.
It's the greatest damn thing.
Coming from a biochemistry background and studying metabolism and cancer, and all of a sudden I'm like into the brain and autism and understanding serotonin, and I love it. It's absolutely true that it takes you to very interesting places, and certainly biology is always surprising you. It's never like you predict.
No, that's right.
But we were talking a little bit like off camera about some of the, you were talking about these some societies that were doing these like long-term running as a sort of possible treatment for depression. Or
well, not a treatment for depression. These are spiritual practices, right?
Okay.
So one of my interests, and this is what we were talking about off camera, was and it's complex how I came to this, but so I was a clinician, saw thousands and thousands of patients a year. And then I became a kind of a researcher and focused on exactly what we're talking about, this immune-brain interface. And one thing led to another, and it's interesting to trace the steps, but I began to realize, we began to look at interventions based on these things. And I began to realize that the scientific data were pointing to the fact that a number of things that people seem to have repeatedly discovered across human history in widely different cultures, mostly for healing and spiritual purposes, seem to have biologic effects and behavioral effects that might be relevant for depression. And so I sometimes say I'm like the ultimate retread guy, that really a lot of what I end up doing is looking at what I sometimes call ancient practices and seeing how can we kind of repurpose them for the modern world. So a lot of my work over the last 5 years is based on this idea that human beings, although we're really remarkably flexible animals, we have a lot of species typical behaviors, and we have, I think, a lot of species typical needs from the environment. There were certain signals across, probably a couple of million years of hominid evolution that reliably signaled either well-being and sort of evolutionary success or danger and failure. And we sort of need those signals to orient ourselves rightly in time and space and behavior, and a lot of them have been just profoundly disrupted by the modern world. And so what you get in the modern world is this wonderful opportunity to do things you never could have done in any sort of hunter-gatherer society. This is a wonderful time to be alive, but it's an astoundingly disorienting time to be alive. And so what I'm interested in is trying to, in a sort of intelligent way, sort of bring back ways to bring back these ancient well-being inputs and integrate them more into our lives so that we get to sort of foundation of a felt mind-body sense of sort of stability and well-being, right? And so it turns out that some of the really interesting ways to do that were co-opted way back. A lot of the easy, low-hanging fruit, easy tricks were discovered, probably in Paleolithic times, but certainly, in the last 10,000 years. And you can make a list of them, and it turns out that there are a lot of things we were talking about. So, immune system stuff, not so much, except that humans co-evolved to, we co-evolve with so many different types of microorganisms that really we should look at ourselves as this sort of, not as individuals, but as communities. Now, those connections have been profoundly disrupted in the modern world, and that accounts for a lot of the sort of allergic, asthmatic, autoimmune problems we have. But I also think there's sort of a lot of the depressive problems.
You're talking about the gut microbiome?
Gut microbiome, but also not just in the gut, but there was a lot of pseudocommensal So we existed in a world where trillions of environmental organisms pass through us all the time, right? They didn't live in us, but they're constantly passing through us. So over time, we become reliant on them to calibrate our immune systems correctly. And of course, the things that pass through us also then modulate the ones that live within us. They form kind of a whole, right? So in that way, there's an immunologic story around ancient associations, around the fact that really we would do well to sort of recalibrate ourselves. We don't want to be hanging out with, we don't want to go back to the times when 50% of everybody born was dead by 15 from infection, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to reintegrate these sort of beneficial bacteria, and not just bacteria, but viruses and fungus, and the whole, we want to get that. But then if you look at things that humans have done repeatedly to induce well-being, to induce healing, to induce sort of transcendent states, you can make a list. Heat, right? So it's astounding the number of cultures in the world that use phasic exposure to high heat for healing purposes or for transcendent purposes, right? So, I mean, we're sitting in the New World, and certainly the use of things like sweat lodges and temescals were just rampant in New World indigenous cultures, but across the Old World too. If you look at the healing rites in the ancient world, hot baths were just a huge part. So it's a widespread human thing all around the globe. So many groups recognized, it's not just living in a chronically hot environment. It's this outrageous heat for a time-limited basis, right? I mean, why would you repeatedly stuff yourself in a smoky, hideous, dark, miserable sweat lodge, right? And answer, because that sort of phasic heat exposure induces profound states of positive well-being that have antidepressant effects, right? There's one. Fasting. Almost every religion worth its salt, both indigenous and these sort of world religions, have fasting as a key element. Well, what does fasting do? Fasting has powerful anti-inflammatory effects. It has powerful beneficial metabolic effects. And although to my knowledge, nobody has rigorously studied fasting as a treatment for depression, there's a lot of literature looking at fasting for sort of related things like pain, and many studies have given mood questionnaires. Fasting has powerful mood elevating effects, and it almost certainly has antidepressant effects. So, running. So the reason I'm giving this whole preamble is, it is amazing to me the number of cultures in the world that have used intense, maybe excessive running as a way of inducing, sort of powerful spiritual states. You see it all around the Native American world, right? I mean, it's just crazy how many cultures use this, and it's become a movement nowadays in Native American communities to use running as a way to sort of overcome a lot of the challenges, alcoholism and drug use and things that exist in those communities. And it's been very successful. It's interesting. There's communities, for instance, in Navajo land, they've got some great things going on where they're re-exposing kids to this sort of long-distance running. I have a long connection with Tibetan Buddhism, and that was very much a practice there. In Buddhism, and we were talking about this off camera, but in Japanese Zen, they're the world record holders. They have this 7-year crazy running protocol training where at the end of it, people run more than 50 miles a day for 100 days straight. And many people die doing this, and because they have to run carrying all their books, and they run in these crazy wooden shoes, and only 48 people have successfully done it since the 1850s. But why would you do this? Well, you do this because it's believed to be a massive inducer of transcendent states. It's a way to achieve Buddhahood in one lifetime. And buried deep within very esoteric Tibetan Buddhist Tantra medical texts are descriptions of natural states that are closest to the mind of the Buddha. So if you ask, what are the states that these are not states of enlightenment, but if you want to know as you wander around in your life, what are the states where you come closest to the mind of a Buddha? One of them is running to the point of exhaustion. Now others are sneezing, urinating, defecating. There's a whole list of them. They're all, turns out that from a tantric Buddhist perspective, rapid shifts in autonomic nervous system functioning seem to be the sort of a semaculum for the mind of enlightenment. But running to the point of exhaustion being one of them. So running, especially, because you think about across evolutionary time, they didn't have bicycles, they didn't have the things we have now. So not so surprising. Now, of course, this ties in, because I'm kind of a reductionist, so I'm always interested in how these sort of spiritual practices were exapted out of behaviors that were necessary for survival and reproduction. And there's this really interesting. Dan Lieberman's kind of the famous guy at Harvard, but there's this idea that human brains may have evolved largely in response to long distance running. Do you know about persistence hunting? right?
Yeah, I know. I didn't know about this theory.
Oh, yeah. So this is really, really interesting stuff. If you ever want to go do it, I can hook you up with the guys that do this. Humans are the greatest thermoregulators in the animal world, right? And it turns out that humans, if you ask, what is the animal that can run 100 miles the fastest? It's humans, probably. And the hotter it is, the truer that gets, right? There's not an animal on the face of the earth that can outrun human beings for 100 miles in a hot environment. And so we know that the human foot evolved long before the human brain. People had modern feet before they had modern brains. And the human foot is remarkably evolved for running. The arch, there's a whole huge story on this. So there's this idea that one of the reasons humans were able to develop these huge brains, which take up 30% of all the energy utilization in our body, was that we were first able to stand upright and thermoregulate, that we were able to sweat, that we were able to cool off. And remember we were talking about thermoregulation being abnormal depression. Thermoregulation is one of the royal roads into human consciousness in ways that are really profound, including this. So humans are able to thermoregulate, and they're able essentially to outrun animals, because it turns out that all other animals, especially four-legged animals, can only cool off by panting, and they can't gallop and pant at the same time. So as long as you can keep an animal just at the pace where they have to gallop every once in a while, they can't cool off. And essentially, humans can outrun them, and outrun them meaning that the animal develops heat stroke and dies, right? Wow. So there's some great footage. You can just on Google, if you just type in persistence hunting. David Attenborough, back now I think 30, 40 years ago, went out with a group of San Bushmen and showed that they could run an eland to death. It's astounding. They run this huge animal. The animal runs, but they just keep it moving enough that it can't cool off, and then finally it just stands there and it goes, and the guy goes, it can't sweat it. It's dying of heat. It's heat shock. The guy just goes up, kills it, hauls it back, and eats it, right? And so humans, I think many of these ancient practices that induce heightened states of awareness evolved out of strategies, unique human strategies for survival and reproduction, but then they become fascinating on their own. Exercise is one of them. Another one that I'm particularly interested and involved with is psychedelics, right? So if you say, well, what's another thing that humans all around the world did repeatedly and for extended periods to alter consciousness? It's psychedelics. It's much older than just humans. Mammals have a tropism, a craving for drugs that make them hallucinate and go crazy. You can make a list. Many mammal species have their psychedelics. Cats have catnip. Elks have it's amazing, a certain kind of moss. So there's something about mammalian brains that are drawn to substances that induce these sort of altered states of consciousness, and widespread use of psychedelic medicines, psychedelic substances around the world. And you say, well, what do these things do? Well, they tap into this interesting human evolved capacity for transcendent states, that can be induced in all sorts of other ways. In one of the most species typical human behaviors is trying to put yourself in a whacked state, a trance state. Dancing, there's a whole list of these things. And the urgency with which these were pursued in indigenous groups is really highlighted nicely by people that were indigenous in my part of the world, which is up about 200 miles from here. I grew up in Fresno in Central California. And prior to them all being wiped out, the Yokuts, that were the indigenous group in Central California, they were one of the world's great shamanistic cultures, but they didn't have good psychedelic substances, and so they felt so strongly about the need to induce these types of experiences at puberty that they would have their young people at puberty, stripped naked and lay on these anthills, and their bodies would be completely covered with ants and bitten. And the ants, I don't know whether it was formic acid, I'm not sure what it was, but there's a substance that if you get, just hideously bitten, it will induce a psychedelic experience. That's the length.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's the length people would go to induce these experiences because they were so integrated into certain societies.
Why did they do it why puberty? Why is this? Was it like a coming of age kind of thing?
Well, in cultures that have a strong shamanistic emphasis, there's a very powerful feeling that you want to identify a spirit guide for a lifetime. So, psychedelic experiences or transcendent trance-like experiences on a repeated basis were usually just the province of a very small group of specialists, shamans, that had very complex relationships with the rest of the population, very ambivalent It's fascinating stuff. But most of these cultures, everybody would at least have one experience, and if that happened, it would be at puberty. And yeah, I think basically that's the time where you sort of have a transcendent experience that orients you to the spirit world, so that you can have, you're not going to have the same potency of spirit guide help that you would have if you're constantly moving into the spirit realm like a shaman would. But it was sort of, people would, everybody sort of wants one of these in those sort of cultures. And so I think that's why they were used there. Now there's some evidence that the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, which we know very little about because they were all kind of hush-hush, but there's some suggestion now, I think in the last 20, 30 years, some research has suggested they may have also ingested psychedelic substances. That was sort of at the core, because these were really the core of spirituality, especially esoteric spirituality in the Greco-Roman world, and we know so little about them because they were so secret, but they were very widespread. Another example of these things being used not just at puberty, but for these sort of transformational purposes. And I know you would, off camera, you told me you interviewed my colleague Roland Griffiths.
Yeah.
And so a number of us are now involved in this work of looking really rigorously at psychedelic substances as treatments for depression.
Right.
Because Roland and Steve Ross at NYU, Roland at Hopkins, showed that a single exposure to something like psilocybin, which is a psychedelic substance in magic mushrooms, tends to induce these very unusual states of mind that often have a kind of mystical characteristic to them. And a single exposure in a couple of studies induced these powerful antidepressant responses that last for like 6 months, longer. I mean, I know from Steve, that he's followed up with people. These are depressed, anxious people with cancer, that those are still alive 2 years later. Many of them, most of them, are still undepressed and not taking
after
antidepressants.
one experience.
Yeah,
That's
profoundly
phenomenal.
life transforming. Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean.
It's one of the most fascinating things going in our world right now.
I know with my discussion with Dr. Griffiths, he was mentioning, again, he did say that this mystical experience seemed to be important for the antidepressant effect, and of course he doesn't really know the mechanism why, but parallel to that, there are also some studies looking at part of the brain that's involved in like rumination. I forgot what it was called.
Default mode network.
Yes, the default mode network, and how that was like changed also.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And of course, rumination, that's a big part of depression.
Huge part. And it's interesting to link back. There's studies linking rumination particularly to inflammation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So inflammation probably preferentially drives rumination. We know from the interferon studies that one of the places that inflammatory molecules most change in the brain is the rumination center in the anterior, dorsal anterior cingulate, right? So there's a beautiful sort of story there. Now, why you should ruminate when that's an interesting question that I don't think we know the answer to. Why should inflammation make you ruminate? But it does. And yes, rumination is a big problem.
Yeah, and that also sort of leads to this, you're talking about these transformative experiences, which also, are brought about by meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there seems to be, at least Roland was talking about some overlap between meditative
absolutely.
state and this something that's happening with this mystical experience. That's, there's sort of mystical experiences are like the common denominator.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's very much like sauna versus my $50,000 fancy machine, right? It's not the machine, it's the heat, right?
Right.
I am utterly convinced it's not the psychedelic. We know it's not the psychedelic, it's the experience, because we know every study pretty much that's looked at this shows that the more intensely you have one of these sort of mystical type experiences, and depending how you define mystical, there's other ways. Spiritual is almost a better word, because people also have these very difficult personal experiences, but that it makes them feel like they see their life in a different way that produces a transformation. They get, that realm of response has just been repeatedly associated with antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects. And not just that, but also these agents seem to have an anti-smoking effect. You help people quit smoking.
Yeah.
You see the same thing there, right? So we think that exactly, there's nothing special about the psychedelics other than the fact that they can take a wide range of people and on cue induce these sorts of experiences. Just like if you want to study inflammation, it's great to have interferon, because I could just wait around until you got inflamed, God forbid, but I'm going to wait, or I could just give you an interferon shot and away you go, right? So in the same way, I could wait around for you to have mystical experience. And there was a wonderful study done a number of years ago that I unfortunately wasn't smart enough to put in my file. I just read about it, where they did this huge sort of anonymous survey of Americans, and I don't know, some crazy percent, 15-20% of people said, I've had a powerful mystical experience that changed my life. I just never talk about it. I was at a kitchen sink, and boom, the world looked like it was, interconnected in ways I'd never imagined. So it happens, right? But it doesn't happen predictably. Whereas, I believe me, if it wasn't illegal and unethical, I could give you a big old dose of psilocybin right now, put you on the couch over there, and it'd be very likely you'd have a profound, mystical experience, right? So, but meditation can do the same thing, absolutely. In fact, last week I was having I've got a colleague named John Dunn, who's kind of one of the world's great experts on Tibetan Buddhism, a great, great scholar, talking about meditative stuff. And we were talking about it, absolutely, that we know people, you can meditate your way into the same types of experience, and I suspect much more profound experiences, because then you're like an athlete of the mystical world. It's not just happening to you by a drug. You're controlling it. Yeah. So there's a very strong overlap.
I've seen now multiple studies where first there's a studies looking at the brains of long-term meditators in how they have various changes in brain volume in certain parts of the brain, and all sorts of things going on, and that taking people that are not experienced meditators and putting them part of this 2-month program, how they can have similar changes in their brain. So clearly, like you were saying, you're kind of like an athlete of this world, where you're absolutely changing, the way your brain's responding to emotional stimuli. And,
we did one of those studies. It's interesting.
Right. Yeah. So you did a study.
Looking at compassion meditation and mindfulness meditation, and in a kind of a health discussion control group. Yes, absolutely. We found some very interesting results. But yes, and Richie Davidson, a colleague of mine, one of my sort of mentors at the University of Wisconsin, has done studies showing that you can take people that are novices and get effects if you really give them 8 weeks of hardcore meditation. And of course, then there's all sorts of interesting data of these people that are just, amazing long-term meditators having very different types of brain pattern activities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I even mentioned to you, I'm not a meditator in the traditional sense, where I'm sitting in a quiet room with my eyes closed, and but I do, for many years, running has been my meditation.
Me too.
Yeah, and it's absolutely, there is a place I go in my brain when I am running that is I am sometimes I'm in the present, sometimes I do daydream, sometimes but it's always a very I just feel so good. I feel so good after. And it helps calm me, and if I'm anxious about something and I go for a run, it's immediately therapeutic for me.
Absolutely. So,
what do you think, right now, I would say that, if a person was depressed or anxious, if they've had some sort of life event that, maybe induced that, a divorce or something like that, they go and see a psychiatrist and they get prescribed a medicine, typically SSRI or something like that, which aren't necessarily always effective and could have side effects. And there's so many of these different lifestyle interventions, the weight loss, the exercise, the whole body hyperthermia via your favorite method, sauna, hot yoga, or hot bath. There's meditation, there's these, psychedelics, which of course, that would be something that you can't really, it's not legal yet. But, for the ones that are, do you think there's any hope that, the medical community will embrace them, that we'll start to have, treatment centers that people are now, they can go and meditate or do hot yoga or sauna, or they can at least be told by their physician, try this?
Yes. No, yes. The science is going to go this way. So it's very interesting. So I specialize in depression. That's kind of what I do. And it's a very, and I actually, my colleague Christine Whelan and I are writing a book about these ancient practices we're talking about, and looking at it in relationship to the pluses and minuses of antidepressants, right? So there's an interesting truth, or there's an interesting thing about antidepressants that's not widely known, which is, and it's a lot like a lot of things. So, if you look at there's these studies showing that, if you start out depressed here, and you do 8 weeks with an antidepressant or a sugar pill, the antidepressant gets you down less depressed. Here's the antidepressant. Sugar pill, also gets you undepressed, but less so, right? And so you think, well, antidepressants seem to work pretty well for everybody. You know, they seem to work better than a sugar pill for people, but that's not the truth.
Yeah.
John Crystal at Yale did this great study where they were able to, I won't bore you with the details, but what really happens is about 70% of people in the United States will do much better in terms of short term with an antidepressant than they will with a placebo. I mean, they really feel better. So there is a group of people that really do well with antidepressants. And by well here, what I mean is that they were really coming apart with depression. And now, you know, a couple of 3 weeks later, they feel like they've got their life back. They feel better. They feel fantastic. 25% of people that are depressed will do much worse with an antidepressant than they would with a sugar pill. And that's what's not widely known. We've seen a very similar pattern in some of our immune intervention studies. It seems like all interventions, or many interventions, may share this, that if they help some people, they may actually hurt others. So the first thing I say to people is, you know, if you're depressed and anxious, and if it is impairing your life, I mean, where you're really having trouble, you know, where you really have it, you know, there is some very good chance that if you take a regular antidepressant, you will feel considerably better. And there's some chance you'll feel like way better, right? And that could be very useful. And so let's just bracket that, right? I mean, these agents are very powerful for a not insignificant subset of the population that's depressed. It's also possible if you take one of those agents that in fact it's not going to help you. That happens a lot. Now what you don't know in fact is that by it not helping you, you know, so if you look at these studies where, you know, what happens is if you don't respond to an antidepressant, most of the time if down is good, you just stay the same. But if I'd given you a sugar pill, you would have done much better, right? So you come to me and say, you know, I'm just not responsive to antidepressants. What's actually happening is that those antidepressants are a absolutely non-optimal intervention for you, right? So there's a whole bunch of people that antidepressants are not optional for, or not optimal for. So that's the first thing. And if you're one of those people, then what do? And that's where these other things become very, very interesting, right? But the problem with antidepressants, as I sometimes say, and I'm a psychopharmacologist, I have seen antidepressants save many lives, and I've seen many people benefit from them. But they are a bit of an unearned grace. They take you from a state, when they work, they take you from a state where you just feel horrible about yourself, you feel horrible about the world, you're anxious, you're miserable, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, or you're eating too much, and you know, you're down on yourself, everything's dark, you can barely get out of bed, you know, you're scared of your shadow, you can't make decisions, right? They can take you from that, and in a month, you can become like super yourself. When they work, you know, now you're confident, you feel better, all that stuff that was bothering you, you're like, yeah, what's the big deal? You know, sue me, right? And all of a sudden the world responds better. They go, oh, I'm so happy to see you. And this is the listening to Prozac, that famous book from the 90s. That's a real phenomenon. But the problem is, and it goes back to what I was saying about the spring versus the thing where you become dependent on, you're only that person when you're taking the antidepressant, right? You take away the antidepressant and it fades. And so that's problem number one. What you'd really like to do is find a treatment that whatever it does, it induces something that's less dependent on something external for your sense of well-being. And the other thing about the other thing about antidepressants is there are some data that the longer you take them, you may become more and more reliant. Your body and brain, you may need them to feel good. There's some evidence that they may induce a vulnerability, so that you have to make a decision in your life. You know, are you going to be Rhonda alone, or are you going to be Rhonda plus Prozac, right? And that's a weird thing.
Yeah, I think I've even seen some evidence where there's changes in there's downregulation of like serotonin receptors, for example, when you're constantly, you have like serotonin in the synapses that's not, you know, being reuptake like it should, it's staying around, and so the receptors are like, oh, there's more serotonin here, and so you start to downregulate.
Right.
So again, if you were to take that away, all of a sudden you have downregulation of receptors, and your baseline's now even, you know.
So relapse rate, so you can take people, and there's a lot of studies now, you can take people who have been in full remission, taking an antidepressant for 2 years, you take it away, and 60-80% of them will have relapsed within a month. I mean, especially if you stop it quickly, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, interestingly, if you take away placebo, people do pretty well. So placebo responses are more stable and more long-lasting than antidepressant responses. And that is a shockaroo, man. I mean, for those of us in the field. So it really speaks to the fact that that this strategy of dealing with the adversities of life and dealing with depression, which is really sort of an evolved response to adversity. I think it's mostly an evolved response to microbial adversity, like we were talking about. But just now that's what it is, all around the world. If you're sick, if you're stressed, if things are going badly and you're vulnerable to it, that's what sets you off into depression. Well, it's much better to take an antidepressant than to kill yourself or to have your life come apart or to just fall apart.
Of course.
Right. But it would be even better if you could find something that would allow that antidepressant response to become endogenous to your own brain-body system. And that's where these alternative practices, and I think some of these ancient practices, have promise. I don't think any of them are antidepressants the way an antidepressant is an antidepressant. I think all these things, what they do is that they set you on a path, or they open a door for you to begin to transform yourself in ways that are going to protect you from depression, right? Because one of the things that when you live with depression for a long time and you watch it, what you see is that the things that tend to make people depressed are those things in their life that are the sort of challenges that emerge out of who they are in terms of their behavior, their thoughts, their feelings, right? So, you think of a lot of examples, but, like a lot of times people become depressed when they, the person who always chooses the wrong partner, right? They, no matter what they do, they always end up with somebody that's abusive to them, or something like that, right? So, what they need to do is transcend that pattern. And if they could transcend that pattern, then a huge driver of their depression goes away. But, when they get depressed, it's because they're approaching it again, or they give up, or they lie to themselves about it, or they, whatever. When you can't, life is like, I believe this deeply, actually, that life is like a series of challenges to perfect sort of the functioning of who I am, who you are as a being, right? The sort of behavioral and biological organization of yourself as an entity. This is a bit mystical mumbo jumbo, but I do think that for reasons I don't fully understand, that this is the challenge of human beings, is to sort of perfect it. And if you do that, that is the ultimate antidepressant strategy. Dalai Lama doesn't get depressed, as far as I can tell, because what he's done, it seems to me, and I know him somewhat, is that he's transformed he's transformed the way his brain-body complex works, so that he's in states of mind that are just inimical to depression, right? And so I think that in fact, is the ultimate antidepressant strategy. But the problem is that it's a lifetime's worth of work and it's extremely difficult. But I think that these alternative things are more likely to drive you that direction than our modern pharmacology.
You make yourself more resilient, right?
I think when they work, you make yourself more resilient, and you begin to develop perspectives that line up very strongly with many ancient wisdom traditions about the truths of what it means to be alive in this particular universe with its challenges, which are there's myriad challenges, right? And so I think that is the ultimate way forward. How that works is interesting, because it's very hard to monetize that, and that's an interesting challenge, right? Because these other ways are far more easy to make billions of dollars off of. Now, how you combine standard pharmacology with this pursuit for this sort of what I might call sort of personal transformation view of antidepressant, thing, that's another really challenging thing, and when are antidepressants sometimes people take antidepressants as an excuse not to face what's going on in their lives. Like, I've known many people, patients, that, they knew, take an example, they knew they're in a marriage and they know that it's just, they need to get out, right? But there's a famous saying that many marriages are saved by, usually the women, because the guys are such dolts, but like that many American marriages have been saved by the woman just being put on Prozac, right? Because when it works, she goes, nah. I can play bridge, I can play golf, he's not so bad. You basically just medicate yourself away from the truth of what you know on a deeper level to be true for you, right? So in that way, the antidepressant is actually working against what I would see as this more optimal way of sort of transforming to sort of coming into full ownership of who you are, and so. But on the other hand, you can imagine somebody that gets up to a wall and they know they need to do this, whatever it is, but it's overwhelming. They can't do it. You put them on antidepressant for a while, and it gives them the sort of chops to hop the wall. Then maybe the antidepressant has become sort of a tool for transformation, right? And I've never seen anybody talk much about this, and I've only been thinking about it for the last 6 months or so. But it's an interesting question. So there's a lot of complexities around this dance of, are there optimal ways of combining these things too? But yes, there's many people that are interested in trying to invoke these sort of, many of them older ways of transformation. So I'll make a plug for one of my closest colleagues, two of my closest colleagues, Rakesh and Sandra Jain, Jain. They have developed a program called the Wild 5, which is this fascinating online-based resource that basically combines exercise, diet, sleep, social connectivity, and what an idiot, I can't think of the fifth one since I'm involved in all this stuff. Let's see, diet, exercise, sleep, social connectivity, and meditation. Yeah, mindfulness. And it's a beautiful program because it's all, it's completely sort of user-friendly and not overwhelming and doable. And it uses a lot of sort of things like tracking your behavior that sort of make people get kind of feedback. So I've been involved in this work with them because we do so much medical education together and we do some research together. And the results are really striking. Man, people do it for 30 days and they feel way, way better. So Rakesh is one of the great psychiatric leaders at the interface of pharma. The guy is very deeply involved in sort of, he's a pharmacologist like me, but way up there. But over the last 10 years, while not abandoning that, he's become utterly convinced that that is not the final way forward, that we really need to move into these sort of transformative wellness practices. And so, the king of pharma goes into this, and he brings some of that expertise into it. But it's a classic example. I mean, they and I, many of us are now talking about, well, how can we develop, various levels of programs that interdigitate these sort of wellness practices.
What was the name of the program again?
The Wild 5.
The Wild 5.
Yeah.
And do they give you advice on protocols to follow for diet?
Absolutely. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Oh, wow,
no,
cool.
it's all kind of protocol manualized. Oh yeah, they've published a book. Yeah, if you just Google Wild 5 together, oh yeah, you definitely will find it.
It's kind of like those 5 things are so incredibly important. I mean, sleep. Of course, sleep deprivation, all that's been shown to be associated with depression or cause depressive symptoms.
Inflammation, weight gain,
inflammation, all right, all of it. And then another thing we didn't talk about was, and you kind of mentioned, you alluded to it with this evolutionary mismatch you mentioned. The world that we live in today is much different. We've got all these artificial lights.
It's a big thing.
Our light exposure is totally changed.
Yep.
Some of us are in offices all day and we're not exposed to bright light during the day, and then we go home at night with all these lights on.
Yep.
So it's kind of, there's a mismatch there. And I do know that there's, I think I sent you a couple of studies, and one was showing that bright light exposure was able to even help treat people with non-seasonal depressive
absolutely.
disorder.
Yeah, there's some nice data on that.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And what I was kind of trying to make was the link between cortisol and the bright light exposure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because of course, that's what entrains to a large degree your cortisol rhythms and probably cytokine rhythms too. They also
right.
have it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's another example of this idea that humans evolved to if not need to function optimally with certain types of inputs. And if you say, well, why do they function optimally with those inputs? It's because across a couple million years, that's what they got. And so they evolved to function optimally with those inputs. The reason we like bright light in the morning and dark at night is because until fairly recently, since the creation of the world, mornings were bright and nights were black, and so we marry ourselves to those conditions because evolution is always trying to optimize the organism to the environment. That's the challenge, right? So we optimize to that mixture of light, but then we also have a sort of an evolutionary mandate to compete with each other, to be productive, and so all of a sudden you invent things like lights, and now you can stay up all damn night and get that and work, because that's also a human mandate, right? I mean, we're these ultimately social creatures, and so we get ourselves in these double binds, where these mandates, one mandate is if you see something sweet, eat it immediately as much as you can because it's rare and it's huge calories, and that's great. So if that's true, then maybe we should just invent nothing but sweet stuff, and that's so awesome. But now we're killing ourselves with sweet stuff. So now we need to, renounce. So it's always likely you get these sort of things where, one mandate in the human world interacts problematically with another, and light is a classic example of that.
Yeah, it is, and the fact that the circadian rhythm is regulated largely by light, also by food intake as well. But the cortisol take on it. Cortisol is a hormone that changes like 25% of the human genome. Many of those genes involved in inflammation, like
Absolutely.
you said.
It's a huge inflammatory.
Yeah, exactly. So totally, makes sense that these two they're interconnected. And having just bright light exposure, there was one study where exposing humans to like 10,000 lux of bright light for 7 hours a day lowered their cortisol response during the rising phase, when it's usually like the highest. And so, there obviously was a anti-inflammatory sort of, or depressive, I guess, immunosuppressive effect as well, because you're not having as high of a cortisol response. Yeah, but another thing that just so many humans don't realize that could also be playing a role in their depression, their way that they're responding to emotional stimuli and all these things. So I personally. My husband and I have tried to optimize to the best of our ability our light exposure. So we have these lights in our house called Philip Hue, which basically you can change color. So blue light is what
That's what you want early in the day,
exactly,
and not what you want at night.
So at night we have our setup. You can time them so that it shuts off the blue light and it turns on red light.
Yeah.
So we have all these red lights around our house that come
cool.
on. Yeah, and it really, really makes a difference. I mean, you get tired. Because you start making melatonin, and so the sleep onset is much earlier than if you were to have, regular old blue lights.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we have, apps on our phone and our computer called Flux, which then also tones down the blue light, so your computer screen isn't emitting the blue light. Yeah. So, but the lights around the house are really cool. They're kind of expensive, but really worth it.
And you have them all around the house.
We have them in every room. Yeah.
What are they called?
In the kitchen. Philips Hue.
H-U-E.
I'll send you.
Okay.
Yeah, H-U-E. I will.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really cool. They do all sorts of colors. They do purple, blue, orange. But we go from the bright blue to red. Yeah. So that's what we're using them for. And then the bright light exposure early in the morning. Like having, going outside for 30 minutes or just making sure you have light in
even
in
on
your
the
house.
cloudiest day.
Yeah.
You get like 5,000 lux on a cloudy day. You cannot. Yeah. It's just.
So even on a cloudy day, you get like.
Oh yeah, you get a lot compared to just sitting in your average room. Absolutely.
And do you know how long? Like, can people just do 30 minutes or an hour? Like, because it's hard.
It is.
Going to work.
I tell people 30 minutes.
30 minutes.
And I mean, yeah, and there's no doubt that the light boxes really help a lot of people, not just seasonal people. So there's another example. There's an interesting example of a simple technology recapitulating natural conditions that optimize human emotional well-being. Now, the other thing that I'm convinced is really important is dark. There's a whole biology of dark. Right?
Like during the time when it's supposed to be dark, like evening.
Yeah. Because even a little bit of light absolutely screws up melatonin release. Blue light mostly. I mean, that's where it's really smart to do this. But I mean, we cannot now. The first academic paper I ever wrote was called "The Moon and Madness Reconsidered," about why the moon was associated with madness in ancient times. Making an argument that the moon was essentially a light source that activated manic episodes because sleep deprivation is such a powerful driver of mania. But as part of that work, I did this massive research on the history of lighting, and it is so interesting. Like for instance, in ancient Rome, Rome was so dark at night that you could go out into the biggest street in Rome and you wouldn't see your hand in front of your face unless the moon was out. I mean, it was just pitch black. People take everything in because it's just total blackness. London was pitch black. There was a massive prostitution business that was run on the London Bridge. We know this because Boswell, Boswell, the guy that wrote the biography on Samuel Johnson, recorded all of his dalliances, and he'd be out there doing it on the bridge. I actually went back and matched the dates of his prostitute things with the phases of the moon in the 1760s, and he was always doing it at dark of the moon. It's fascinating, right? So I mean, London, the greatest city on earth in that time, was so dark that you could do that. This is in the 1760s. So, we just, and there's a guy named Tom Ware. He's retired now, but he was sort of the king of the circadian stuff for many years at NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. And he actually did this great study where in particular, he took this one just impossibly bipolar person, stuck him in the dark for 12 hours every day for a year or so, and just profoundly fixed the guy, right? So darkness. Now, darkness is another example, actually, of an ancient spiritual practice. So one of the most bizarre of sort of tantric, heavy-duty Tibetan Buddhist practice is something called the dark retreat, where people go into utter, complete darkness for 49 days straight.
49 days, wow.
That's the length of time that they believe. That's the maximal length of time between reincarnations.
Now, are they also in silence as well? Silence and dark?
Silence, except for a couple times a day when people slip. They've got some mechanism now for slipping food under the door.
But they're not
people
talking
checking
to anyone.
No,
So.
no. And they start hallucinating like mad. And the point
Wow.
the point of that is utter sensory deprivation, right? The point of that then is to, from their perspective, the point of that is to recognize that the whole world can arise from the creation of their mind, and so they realize that this world is also sort of insubstantial. I mean, that, at least that's my understanding of the spiritual. But isn't it amazing that something like dark can also be appropriated for spiritual practices? Now, whether it would have any therapeutic potential is kind of unknown, but it's on my bucket list, not to do 49 days, but to go, and I've got an invitation to go check it out. Yeah.
Wow.
Very famous television journalist is going to come.
It's hardcore.
It's hardcore.
Are you familiar with some of the gene polymorphisms, the SNPs in? There's one gene that I think it's NPAS2.
Yes.
That is involved in circadian rhythm, but also their susceptibility to bipolar disorder, like when it's dysregulated. So again, sort of this.
Yes. Well, especially bipolar disorder. You know, if regular depression is sort of an evolved human response to the adversity of relationship, bipolar disorder is a response to the adversity of time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what you see with bipolar disorder is that so folks with bipolar disorder are also, they can be set off into either manias or depressions by stress, right? But they're also exquisitely sensitive to fluctuations in circadian patterns, right? So the great way to induce a manic episode is to just keep people awake. So there's wonderful data from the 1980s from the National Institute of Mental Health where they'd keep really very ill bipolar patients in psychiatric wards for years and study every episode, and always depressive but especially manic episodes would be triggered by a night of sleep deprivation, right? And you see this clinically, right? So time is an adversity because it's constantly threatening homeostasis, right? So the things we're talking about, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, this happens, that happens, this happened, and your body's going up and down. Anytime things move, there's always a risk of things coming off the rails and breaking, right? And so bipolar folks are so profoundly vulnerable to disruptions in their circadian sleep-wake cycles, in their activity cycles. Ellen Frank was one of the originators of this. It's called chronotherapy. It came out of the University of Pittsburgh, where they actually, as a therapeutic thing for bipolar disorder, part of it was education about you always go to sleep at the same time, you get up at the same time. You be careful about air travel, right? There's a beautiful study from Heathrow showing that, that there's a hugely increased risk of people showing up at Heathrow with a psychotic mania if they come from America to Heathrow than if they come from Asia to Heathrow. And the reason is because it's a sleep deprivation thing. If you're coming from here, that's why you're always exhausted. When you land in Europe, you've missed a night of sleep. Oh, so many manic patients I saw in my years running the emergency psychiatry at UCLA. Many of them were activated by getting on a plane.
Wow.
I was normal until I got on a plane. And I got off the plane, and the world looked different. And then they're off and gone, right? So
that's what patients would say?
Oh, yeah. And first episodes were often induced. I mean, people really develop these lifelong psychotic disorders in response.
Do you think those people that are having that are a little more sensitive to their circadian, they maybe have some SNP and...
this is probably why the NPAS, which is one of the great kind of drivers or regulators of the circadian things, is a predictor of bipolar disorders because, it's a condition where the changes of time, the recurrent changes of time are just a big stressor for that disorder.
Yeah, and probably lots of genes are not being regulated properly, right?
That's right.
It's like a transcription factor regulating a whole host of genes, and so their response to things are very different because they're not activating all those pathways that you're supposed to activate.
Yeah. Whereas what's interesting is if you don't have that bipolar risk, most of us do not end up in the psych hospital because we missed a night of sleep.
Yeah.
Right? We end up in the psych hospital because the person we cared about dumped us, or somebody died, or we lost, or we were shamed, or it's just the things, when something tees it off, it's a different register of things that tee it off, which is so interesting. It's one of the main differences between.
When I miss a night of sleep, like if I'm traveling abroad, I certainly feel strange when I land in Heathrow or any other airport in Europe or even Asia. but I certainly don't feel.
Yeah, you're not.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like, it feels kind of weird.
Right.
You know,
But you're not psychotic.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I don't actually have that,
Yeah.
that SNP, so.
Yeah.
But fascinating conversation that we've had. We've talked about so many different things. Really, you just published a book. What's the name of the book?
The book, I published it with one of my other closest colleagues, Vladimir Maletic. It's called The New Mind-Body Science of Depression.
The New Mind-Body Science of Depression.
700 pages. It's a monster.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
And so if people are more interested in sort of learning more about some of the stuff that...
a lot of the stuff we've talked about, right? So all the inflammation stuff we've talked about is in there. All the evolutionary stuff we've talked about is in there. A lot of stuff about the risk factors for depression is in there. And then if you want to take just a very deep dive into the neurobiology of depression, a lot about you know, kind of wide-scale brain abnormalities in depression, molecular abnormalities in depression, and then a few cases too that people seem to enjoy. They're sort of a little bit easier sledding around sort of how these things apply. I discussed hyperthermia, so I actually talk about one of my hyperthermia cases that had like a miracle cure to hyperthermia. So it's interesting. Yeah,
Cool.
A lot of it's in the book.
Cool. And the book, so it's available, is it like on
published
Amazon?
published by Norton. It's available.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's available sometimes in Barnes and Noble, and it's available on Amazon. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Really, really happy to have this discussion with you.
Thank
I
you. This is
definitely want to
awesome.
stay in touch, and I'll send you studies whenever I come across them.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Thank you. This was great. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah.